I've had lots of tenant clients asking in recent weeks, are they entitled to a rent concession? Perhaps because they've had to close their premises due to COVID, or perhaps because they've reopened and the footfall hasn't returned to the same levels as before lockdown. We know that the city centres are much quieter at the minute with many people working from home. So whilst I've replied that certainly there's no entitlement to a rent concession, that there's no harm in asking, and when reporting back on their experiences, I've had a range of experiences from tenants getting a much better and more generous rent holiday than they were ever expecting, to landlords failing to engage in conversation at all, which obviously is completely contrary to the government's code of practice that they brought in during lockdown, which is aimed at trying to protect viable businesses. So a common myth is, on the part of many tenants, is that if they've spoken to the landlord or perhaps had a few exchanges of emails where they have agreed a rent concession, that email or that conversation is sufficient. Now, my advice is always to properly document whatever agreement has been reached with the landlord. But I wondered, Laura, do you have any examples of what can happen if such a concession isn't properly documented?
Thanks, Helen. So yeah, of course, the advice is always to properly document it. There isn't any actual legal requirement for it to be in any particular form, but the chances of you covering off every single eventuality and every single term with sufficient detail is unlikely unless you've got it in one document that's been properly drafted. If you do have an agreement between the landlord and tenant, and that is crystal clear, then that should sufficiently protect you. And if a landlord then needs to pursue the tenant for rent arrears that have accrued outside of that agreement, then there should be no legal obstacles in theory. The problem comes where there's a dispute as to what the terms are. So if you take, for example, a tenant contacting a landlord, a retail tenant saying, I've been forced to close due to lockdown, can I have 3 months rent free, and then can I also then have half price rent for a while until the end of lockdown, which is a term that's being used a lot between landlords and tenants, or until the end of the pandemic. So if you take that as an example, the landlord agrees to those terms in an email, say, and the landlord then believes what they have is an agreement where no rent will be paid for 3 months. After that, half price rent will be paid. Once the tenant can reopen, full rent will fall back in place, and I will receive my arrears in due course over that period. The landlord probably also believes that if the tenant defaults, they can forfeit the lease because they've not caught up with those rent arrears. Landlord might also believe that they can serve notice at the end of the lease, refusing a new renewal lease on the grounds of those persistent delays in paying the rent during the course of the previous lease. Now, that's very different to what the tenant would probably believe they'd agreed on that same exchange of emails. So a tenant may think that they have 3 months completely rent-free, followed by half-price rent for not just the lockdown period, but any period in which I've got reduced business for. So the lockdown period can be taken to be up to the 4th of July by some people. I'm sure there'll be case law on this as to who considers what period's appropriate. But the tenant probably believes that runs until all restrictions are lifted. Nobody knows when that's going to be. It could even be years. The tenant would also believe that they don't have to catch up with those arrears, and that at the end of the current lease, they'll have a right to renew that lease and get a new lease without the landlord refusing. So who's right and who's wrong in this scenario could take a long time to sort out. Whilst that's being sorted out, both sides have got uncertainty, both sides have got legal fees, and even the winner will be out of pocket considerably in terms of costs that they can't claim, lost business time, and also the stress of litigation. So that is just a snapshot of what can and will and does go wrong when things aren't properly documented.
Okay, following on from that, another question we get asked is, you know, can a landlord forfeit a lease or take possession of the premises in those circumstances?
So provided you have, we're assuming a situation where you've got clear rent arrears. Before the Coronavirus Act 2020, the standard advice would be check your lease terms. Normally says you can forfeit by taking peaceable re-entry, so that's when you just go in and change the locks. It normally says you can do that 7, 14 or sometimes 21 days after the default from the tenant, so when your rent's full and due, tenant's not paid. As long as you haven't committed any acts of waiver, so that is normally you've sent in bailiffs, you've chased, you've received the rent. If you've received a rent payment, that normally disentitles you to use to forfeit the premises. But since the Coronavirus Act 2020, there's a total bar on any forfeiture or possession claims for residential and commercial property. For commercial properties, this is now going to last until the end of September. What happens after that, I've got no idea, and I wouldn't even try and guess. There's a few possibilities. One is that it'll be extended. The other is that it will go completely back to the way it was. And the third option, there's somewhere in between, is maybe a change in law where they remove waiver, they introduce notice periods or something like that. So we're all just watching and waiting to see what will happen after the end of September.
Okay, thank you. If we can move on to the subject of tenant break clauses. So I know a number of tenants that have used, say, an upcoming tenant break option as leverage to try and re-gear their terms onto their lease onto more favourable terms, which can be a pretty dangerous game if you don't actually want to come out of the premises. Again, I've seen a range of responses from landlords, from embracing that request and perhaps agreeing an extended lease in return for those more favourable rent terms, perhaps moving from a standard fixed rent scenario to a turnover rent. And in some cases there's been no response at all, which effectively then calls the tenant's bluff as to whether they will actually go ahead and serve a break notice to end the lease. Of course, serving break notices is not just as simple as serving the notice, moving out, and your lease comes to an end. There are some pretty significant hoops to jump through to ensure that the notice is valid. And Laura, I think you probably get to see the rather unpleasant side of tenant break notices, and I wondered if you got some examples that you could share with us.
So yeah, break notices and break clauses are a really, really interesting area. Obviously, the courts are very, very strict on their approach, so everything does have to be absolutely right. I agree that strategy, while it's used a lot by retail tenants and landlords, it is a dangerous game. A slightly safer option is to try and deal with these things in advance, so well before you would even serve your break. So perhaps even 12 months or more before the break date, or even before the break notice is due. Because you can then agree a rejig of the lease and enter into a new lease before you even have to serve your break. So that is much safer than what I've seen with some retail tenants who leave that kind of brinksmanship in terms of bluffing and bluff and double bluff, meaning that I've seen retail tenants, even high street chains, stripping out their stores 2 days before the break, storing everything in storage to make it look like that they are capable of complying with the vacant possession covenant, which would end the lease, just simply to get a better deal, knowing that actually it's in their business plan to remain. They just want a better deal, which, yeah, it's a very dangerous game to play. When it comes to break notices, I've seen all manner of invalid break notices. Notices served by a new tenant where the old tenant's still a registered title holder, where the notice has been served on the wrong person, for the attention of the wrong person, to an old landlord, to the landlord's agent, not served in enough time, not dated correctly, not signed by the right people, not sent on behalf of the right people. not served on an agent when they should have served on the agent as well. It's an absolute minefield, and it has to be absolutely bob on. So obviously always take advice, but take advice sooner than you think you need to, is the general rule of thumb, I'd say.
Yeah, definitely. So, you know, assuming that a tenant does go on to serve a break notice, let's say to focus the landlord's mind on whether they are really open to negotiating some more favourable terms with the tenant, or looking at facing an empty property and a business rates liability. I've dealt with tenants before who have then thought if a deal's reached in principle with their landlord, they can just revoke their break notice, carry on the same lease, but on the new terms that they've agreed with the landlord. And I can understand why tenants might be surprised to hear that actually legally you can't do that. You can't just revoke a break notice. A new lease actually needs to be put in place before the break date. And, you know, there are ways of keeping that process simple. I know, contrary to popular belief, we don't like making a job more complex than it needs to be. There are simple ways of perhaps renewing the lease by reference to the existing lease with maybe a short schedule of terms, reflecting the new terms. But the main thing is that the new terms need to be documented in a new lease before the break date to avoid the risk to both sides. These things, as we've already alluded to, often go right to the wire, and I wondered if you've got any words of warning or examples where that kind of arrangement has been used.
Yes, I mean, yeah, it can happen both sides. It can happen both sides. I think we could probably call it kind of break notice chicken, because you're seeing who's going to stop first, or who's going to go flying headfirst into the road. But yes, I've seen it in a situation where a tenant pushed it to the point. The landlord didn't believe that the tenant was going to leave and thought, here's my final offer, you take these terms or you're not getting a new lease, and the tenant just left. And then the landlord stuck with an empty property. So it can work both ways, and I think that's going to be increasingly the case at the moment in the high street, because there's going to be more and more empty properties. So I think tenants are going to have the upper hand to agree these things, like I said, earlier as possible. But also they're going to have the upper hand in terms of negotiations as against the landlords, to make sure they don't have an empty property. But from a tenant's point of view, it doesn't look good, does it? It doesn't look good on the marketplace if you look like you're closing down and then you're not. It looks like you've had to experience some issues, and a lot of consumers will just simply believe that you've gone pop, along with a lot of other retailers. So it's a gentle balance to make between these 2 points, making sure you've got the maximum negotiating power, but at the same time, you're protecting your interests and protecting the future of the business. So I think that's everything. So thank you everyone for watching. If you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. Our contact details should appear aside this video shortly. Thank you.